Here we go again with the U.S. and Iran in another round of strikes. On Saturday, Iran says it hit U.S. targets in the Middle East. Bahrain is the country so far to confirm strikes happened within its borders. The Iranian strikes were in response to an earlier U.S. military strike on Iranian facilities on Friday. Here's a map of where the U.S. hit on Friday. This is not the first time the city of Sirak has been struck. It's been the target of U.S. attacks in the past. And we also have footage released by the Pentagon. Washington says it did this in response to Iran attacking a cargo ship trying to pass the Strait of Hormuz on Thursday. So Thursday, Friday, then Saturday, each day has seen action by one country in response to the other. It's a bit confusing, but that is what conflicts are. So it looks like this agreement, that memorandum of understanding, didn't last very long, or maybe these strikes are just a quick round that is largely over. We're going to take a closer look to make sense of what feels like never-ending strikes and counterstrikes and months of talks to see what this all adds up to. How does the region, especially the Gulf, live with this new normal? What does everyone need to do to adapt? To talk about all this, we have Simon Mabon, professor of international politics at the School of Global Affairs at Lancaster University. Simon's specialty is Middle East politics and dynamics, and he's been following the Iran conflict very closely over the past few months. Simon, thanks for joining us over the weekend. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So it looks like there are two ways of interpreting these latest rounds of strikes: as a one-off that will have little impact on the overall picture, or as an indicator that this kind of tit-for-tat will become a new pattern. I'm curious what your read is on this. And right before I got in front of the camera, we have news that a tanker has been reported as being struck by some kind of unidentified projectile. So that's the latest. A hit on Thursday, a hit on Friday, a hit on Saturday, and then now something else happening later on Saturday. What's your read?
Yeah, I think the MOU is obviously a hugely important step, but it's a step that brings with it a whole host of precarious dynamics. And I think right now it's under a great amount of pressure. We've seen, obviously, the continuation of the conflict in Lebanon, despite the agreement between the Israelis and the Lebanese that has been brokered of late by Washington. And we're obviously seeing these strikes on tankers. We're seeing the reciprocal attacks on Iran and indeed on U.S. targets, U.S. bases across the region. So I think that tells us that even though there is an MOU that has been signed, and that there has been substantial diplomatic progress being made by the parties involved in these talks, that doesn't mean that the conflict is over. And I think few were really accepting that the MOU meant that this was an end. I think we're going to see more and more of these tit-for-tat attacks, more and more of these reciprocal attacks, partly because of the need to continue with the posturing to say, look, we are negotiating from positions of strength. And that, I think, is a bit of a worry, because we've seen over history, in fact, that reciprocal attacks can very, very easily lead to spirals, which can derail diplomatic initiatives.
And speaking of posturing, we have Vice President J.D. Vance certainly suggesting that the U.S. is open to repeating another round of strikes. I want to read what he posted on social media. Iran signed a ceasefire agreement. We have honored it. If they have disagreements about how the MOU is being applied, they can pick up the phone. But violence will be met with violence. So expressing there both a willingness on the U.S.'s part to strike again, but also suggesting Tehran should talk to him. What do you make of that post on social media?
Well, I think we can read it in lots of different ways, of course. I think as I was listening to you, I was thinking, how would those in Tehran read this? And I think there would be a great deal of anger about what J.D. Vance has said in Tehran, in the sense that, well, the U.S. has not necessarily fulfilled its obligations under the MOU. It's not necessarily acted in good faith, particularly with regard to what's happening in Lebanon. The ceasefire was supposed to be enacted across Lebanon as well as elsewhere. The MOU included Lebanon, the first clause of that memorandum of understanding included Lebanon. And yet we saw continued Israeli destruction of South Lebanon, continued bombardment, continued evacuation, and eviction of people living in South Lebanon. And so for the Iranians, that's pretty clear, I think, that the US has not acted in good faith over its commitment and obligations to stop Israeli violence. Now, for JD Vance, of course, I think he can read it in a slightly different way. He'll say, look, we've enacted this diplomatic agreement. We've got a diplomatic agreement between Lebanon and Israel, and we've got commitments from the Lebanese state to disarm Hezbollah. That is all in line with our commitments to the first clause in the memorandum of understanding. And yet the Iranians have hit a target, and so we've had to respond. So it can be read in lots of different ways, and I think that this subjectivity of all of this, of course, is what makes it so challenging to get headway, to build momentum, and makes it so difficult to build that consensus between the Iranians and the Americans.
And Simon, you certainly know this, studying Middle East politics for so long. It can be very cyclical. I want to pull up a satellite image of the Strait of Hormuz. If you look, there are a lot of ships, but just there at the bend at the top, that passage, you can count just a handful of ships relative to other areas on the screen you're seeing. So it doesn't look like that many ships are passing, and this is from maritime traffic, by the way. And then you can see the clusters of ships still hanging back around what seems like the ports. So the passage through this strait is nowhere near pre-war levels, and this latest strike is hardly reassuring. I guess my question is, how are shipping companies assessing the current risk compared to pre-MOU? It must be hard for insurers, for example, to make the call, yes, this ship can pass. Now, we've got at least 2 tankers that have been hit.
Yeah, of course. I think inherently insurers and shipping companies are risk averse, and I think that's why we're seeing a much reduced amount of traffic going through the strait, particularly given that Donald Trump was so keen to get the strait reopened. But I think right now what we're seeing is that the Strait of Hormuz is in fact Schrodinger's strait. It's simultaneously open and closed depending on who you ask. And by virtue of that, by virtue of the fact that the Iranians have said that they've closed it previously, and by virtue of the constant attacks that we're seeing, or the continued attacks that we're seeing, I should say, then shipping companies are incredibly reluctant. They know that their cargo is hugely valuable. The insurance premiums have skyrocketed. So I think it's hardly surprising that we're seeing risk-averse shipping companies and reduced traffic by virtue of companies wanting to avoid any dramatic incidents or any dramatic hits to their profits.
Yeah, it's very confusing because the price of oil has fallen dramatically from highs of over 100 to, I think, about the 70s. And though regular traffic hasn't resumed through this strait. So how should we square that circle?
So I think this is about perception, really. I mean, we're seeing quite a significant fall in petrol and diesel prices in the UK, quite significant and quite dramatic over the past couple of weeks. And I think that tells us something about optimism and hope for the future rather than anything changing dramatically on the ground. I think we saw Donald Trump talking about a possible end of oil reserves and running out in a matter of weeks. And I think that was one of the factors that was driving up prices quite significantly. But what we're seeing now with the strait simultaneously being open and closed, the Schrodinger's Strait, as I've said, the oil companies, the oil markets are perhaps slightly being optimistic that, look, the MOU says we're going to have a deal, we're opening up the strait, that we're not quite on the precipice of such a catastrophic drop-off. So I think there's a sense of optimism that's clouding the markets right now. But I would imagine that if we see this continued violence, these continued tit-for-tat attacks, and we continue to see a lack of diplomatic breakthroughs or substantial diplomatic breakthroughs, then oil prices sadly will probably end up rising again.
Schrodinger's strait. Simon, I wonder if that's something that you've coined, or is that something that a lot of analysts in your world use as a line over the last few weeks? So nothing is really back to normal. Most analysts were deeply skeptical of the MOU, and this strike seems to confirm that. I want to ask about the Gulf states, because how do you think they're going to move forward? Will they have to live with the U.S. and Iran exchanging fire every week, or think about that for the rest of the year? Is it sort of not just a new normal, but a new pattern?
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of trepidation. There's a great deal of anger, angst, uncertainty, fear, paranoia. All of the emotions are dominant in the Gulf states and their capitals, the corridors of power, because the Gulf states don't know what's going to happen next. They were hoping that this would be avoided and averted back in February with the signing of a nuclear deal. They were confident that a deal could be reached. And then, of course, we went down the path of over 100 days of conflict, with the Gulf states being targeted quite heavily by the Iranians by virtue of them hosting US bases. And yet, US bases were able to, or the US defense technologies and capabilities were able to avoid widespread catastrophic damage to the Gulf states. So again, they're in a bit of a bind here, that the presence of the Gulf states makes them targets, but the presence of the Gulf of the US military allows them to try and limit and diminish the capacity for destruction that Iran has sought to wreak on them. So they're in a bit of a bind here. But I think what a lot of them are thinking is, we're in a position where we can't change our geography. We can't move ourselves, obviously, or move Iran from the map. So we have to find a way of working with Iran, much as they perhaps do not want to do so at this point, having had the massive erosion of trust over the past few months. But at the same time, they do not want to see a continuation of the conflict. They don't want to see tit-for-tat attacks. They want to see things going back to a sense of being able to sell oil, of being able to enact economic visions, of the Emiratis, for example, being able to welcome tourists in with confidence that the hotels will not be targeted. So they want to see a retreat back to a way of doing business in a pragmatic manner. But they obviously can't do that if the conflict is continuing, even at a low level, just by virtue of the anxieties that start to come out here. So I think there's a great deal of trepidation. I think there's a great deal of angst. And I would imagine the corridors of power in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Doha, Manama and Kuwait City, they're trying desperately to get this MOU to be something substantial that can put an end to this once and for all.
It's certainly hard to envision the long-term picture here. I'm trying to think of, like, for example, Lebanon or other parts of the Middle East beyond the Gulf have been in situations where there's been sort of conflicts that's gone on or dragged on for years or even decades, and has managed to still have an economy, and businesses have been able to continue to conduct their work, and banks to operate. I guess, do you have a sense of how the Gulf region has been trying to conduct and do business, not just the energy sector, but also beyond? I mean, you touched on a little bit about the tourism, but and of course the flights are kind of back to normal. But what is normal life there like? What is normal commerce starting to look like?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of time to build up and to really get normal back to the way that normal was defined and understood back in February. I think the normal right now is everything's at a much lower level. There's a much greater sense of anxiety and uncertainty around what normal could be. Whereas back in February, normal was confidence, it was bombastic, it was pushing at the possible, what could be done, what was conceivable, and what could really be achieved in tourism, in economics, in business, in construction. And we saw these huge projects, NEOM, for example, the line in Saudi Arabia, that although they faced certain economic challenges that meant that they were curtailed a little bit, they were still visionary projects that were pushing at what was possible in terms of technology and in terms of infrastructure. Now, that, of course, is all with a big asterisk next to it. To what extent can that happen? To what extent will consumer confidence be restored? To what extent will investor confidence be restored at a time when when investors don't know what the next few months will hold. Will it hold more fighting? Will it hold reciprocal attacks? Or will it go back to a sort of pragmatic set of possibilities where people can trade and make money? And I think that sense of confidence is really key here. And it's nowhere felt more keenly than tourism. To what extent can you go on holiday and be confident that you will be safe, that your hotel will not be hit, and that you will not be living under anxiety about continued attacks? And we've seen the Emiratis having to drop prices, hotel prices. They've dropped through the floor, and that's a consequence of this dropping of confidence. Even though the flights are back. So I think confidence is key, but confidence is intimately bound up in what's going to happen next, whether there can be a final agreement or whether we're going to be stuck in this limbo.
Simon, for my final question to you, it's kind of unbelievable as I think about a week ago where we saw U.S. President Donald Trump sign this MOU, and you can see right there he's doing that in a pretty grand way at the Palace of Versailles. He clearly wanted it to be a historic moment, and he looks pretty pleased with himself there. When the video pulls out, there you go. And so here we are, as many analysts warned we would be in this kind of scenario. I want to talk about the pictures we're seeing versus the reality. How will this image go down in history?
Well, the optics of it are wonderful, of course. It's such an incredible place, replete with history, a sense of grandeur and splendor. But, of course, the sense of history weighs heavily on that image. We know, obviously, the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War and had a key impact in shaping the nature of the Middle East. Not just for good, but dramatically in having a huge impact on shaping colonial borders, on dividing the Middle East up, on creating new states that were replete with sectarian differences. So the weight of history weighs heavily on that photo, and I think scholars and students of history will say, well, there's a certain irony to Trump trying to do that in Versailles, given the real darkness that followed the signing of the Treaty of Versailles for the Middle East. And I think that specter of uncertainty and horror weighs heavily on Trump's image right now. Of course, superficially, it's incredible and the optics of it are great, but I think history may come to tell a slightly different picture there.
Simon Mabon, thank you so much for joining us. And that is all for now from me. As always, you can get the latest across our social media platforms. I'm Melissa Chan. Until next time.